let us start.
Trouble in the front row.
Let's bring ourselves a little bit here, feel that we are here in this great, beautiful hall, and after wonderful dinner and a birthday cake, so we are all beautifully nourished. Happy birthday, Caroline. And this is a great pleasure for me to be in dialogue with my good friend, Jonathon. Jonathon and I first met when Jonathon lived in the basement of a house in St. John's Wood. And I had become just the editor of a magazine at that time called Resurgence, so 1973. And Green Party, you will remind us properly. Ecology Party at that time. And Jonathon was teacher in a school, but also he was very much sort of involved and engaged with Ecology Party, which eventually became Green Party.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so we started working together, and then with Schumacher Lectures, Resurgence Magazine, and then we started Schumacher College. And so Jonathon came for 5 weeks to teach the course there. So we had a long-standing sort of friendship and working relationship. And Forum for the Future, Friends of the Earth, all the things which Jonathon perhaps will mention when he talks about. But one thing I would like, because we have been together in this green, environmental, ecological change movement, it would be good to have a little reflection of how things have changed and how things have moved, and how, because you were steeped in the movement with Friends of the Earth and Green Party and all the other things. If you could reflect on how in these 50 years of our work in the movement has changed, evolved, has problems, has successes, has failures, what do you think of the green movement in general?
Well, all I can say is there are far fewer people telling me that I am completely mad. Yep. That may come as a surprise to some of you, but my kind of dominant memory of the 1970s with anything to do with the Green Party in particular, which was a minority party by definition.
Yeah.
I think I was the 75th person to join, and it was a bit of a wacky bunch. The previous 74, obviously. But it was very easy to dismiss all of that in the 70s, incredibly easy. It was sort of the default position. What are you going on about? This is so odd. And that, notwithstanding the fact that already by the 70s, of course, Friends of the Earth and Greenpeace were established, organizations like WWF and other big international NGOs had been around for quite a long time, but there was still a sense this wasn't serious. And I suppose you could, if you tracked it on ability to be in and influence the mainstream, if you did a kind of chart of the 50 years from those early days in the 70s to where we are now in 2022, and you kind of tracked the degree to which the same ideas, because as you said earlier, Blueprint for Survival was published 50 years ago, so the same ideas have moved in terms of their closeness to more mainstream thinking. I was about to use the phrase establishment thinking, and then I thought, no, don't do that. So mainstream thinking, that's extraordinary.
Yeah.
Change number one. Change number two is the state of the science. Let's be absolutely honest. In the early 70s, much of the scientific evidence on which we were basing our work was pretty thin.
Yeah.
It really was. I mean, we like to think differently, but the United Nations Environment Programme only came about in 1974 and started to create a baseline for the incredible story of environmental and climate science over 50 years. I mean, that is the most remarkable record when you look back on that.
Yeah.
As a big change. And for me, those two things are absolutely critical. As to the extent to which we've actually made anything change, that's a bit harder. I quoted from Rebecca Solnit as part of the course because a lot of her sense of the history of this is try and keep in your mind all the really awful things that we've stopped happening. And you may not you may not hear about those things because they've just, once you've done it and you've stopped something happening, people move on and try and stop another bad thing from happening. But the truth is, as in really big picture outcomes, to stop this juggernaut model of economic progress via destruction of the earth, progress has been extremely limited.
Yeah.
I would say.
Yeah, I agree with that. Small changes have taken place, perhaps, when in 70s, the idea of recycling was not very mainstream. That has become more mainstream, and now more people are at least thinking and doing a little bit recycling. But what I remember of 70s was a very great time of profound thinking. And we had people like E.F. Schumacher writing about ecological economics and small is beautiful. And people like John Seymour about self-sufficiency, and Leopold Kohr about small is beautiful. And actually Schumacher took small is beautiful idea from somebody called Leopold Kohr. Many of you may not have heard of him, but he wrote a wonderful book at that time called Breakdown of Nations. And John Papworth, my predecessor of Resurgence editorship, he was a great friend of Leopold Kohr, and Resurgence was started with the idea of promoting small is beautiful, more decentralized, more local, and more small scale, human scale. And so it was a kind of time of great ideas at that time. And then James Lovelock in science, and then Arne Naess in philosophy, and also around the world, people like Fritjof Capra in now of physics. So, and the 60s, Rachel Carson. So I would say that was a very great time of sort of more fundamental, profound thinking and researching, which now has become a kind of accepted. And now there's a more time of activism, more actual change. People are in the movement, people are working more towards changing rather than so much thinking. Would you agree with that?
Probably. I'm trying to think. I was about to ask you, who are the contemporary equivalents of that pantheon of great green thinking that you've just mentioned?
Yeah.
Who do you look to today as the equivalents of people who were doing that in the 70s?
It's a good question, and I would struggle. But there is somebody called David Abram in the United States who has written a number of good books, and one of them is Spell of the Sensuous. And he's a very good thinker, but not as popular and accessible as E.F. Schumacher or even James Lovelock or Arne Naess. Arne Naess was not so accessible, but somehow with deep ecology, that idea caught, and John Seymour with self-sufficiency, and Lady Eve Balfour with living soil and starting Soil Association. All those things are, I think at this moment, there are more activists in the field, and people more kind of doing things and making things, implementing those ideas, rather than writing great books.
I love that idea, because that means that the foundations, the philosophical, intellectual, spiritual foundations were laid at that time, and then progressively it's become easier for people to build on that through their campaigning work. I have to say, Satish, however, that ours is a phenomenally ahistorical movement. All those names you've just mentioned, if I was to share most of them with most of my colleagues in the contemporary campaigning world of climate and the environment, they would look at me and say, who? Seriously.
Seriously, yeah.
We have almost one of my abiding insights from green activists is history is completely irrelevant, and I do worry about that.
Yes.
Because there are many values through absorbing some of the historical lessons, and we're only talking 50 years here. But one of them is that you don't obviously you hope not to repeat some of the mistakes of the past. So this ahistoricity, this kind of story that everything is minted new and fresh, and we don't need to acknowledge what's gone before. With colleagues on our course this week, I said when XR launched in 2018, they were utterly dismissive of everything that had gone before. As if nothing that had gone before was of any value whatsoever, and only XR had that priceless insight at that moment to change things in the way that only they could do. So every single bit of campaigning work from all those organizations up until that moment was seen to be so easy to dismiss, so irrelevant.
Yeah.
And I think that's quite, honestly, I think that's quite standard.
Yeah.
So I worry a bit about that.
Yes.
I don't worry that much about it. There's so many other things to worry about.
Yeah.
I mean, let's just, that was the 70s, Satish, for God's sake.
What has also changed to some extent, not so much for the good, is that in the 70s and 80s, when these writers were writing, there was an idea that we need a kind of change of worldview, change of paradigm, change of thinking, change of philosophy, change of science, a change of lifestyle, a much more profound change we need. E.F. Schumacher always talked about profound change. But in modern times, and I would like your reflection on it, in the kind of, since this new 21st century, there's a much more emphasis on technological answers and technological solutions rather than changing our worldview and changing our lifestyle and changing our thinking and living more simply and living more frugally and all those things. Technological solutions. And mainstream, of course, wants technological solutions because they want to have business as usual, economic growth must continue, business must continue, business as usual, but we can have new technology which will have less pollution and less carbon emission and less climate change maybe. We can affect climate change. So for example, COP26 in Glasgow, I mean, some people, I think Jane Goodall, I was talking to her, and she said it was a cop-out. And so COP26 was a cop-out because they were all talking about technological solutions and that kind of thing rather than some fundamental change of our values. Whereas what people are thinking about, what kind of new culture, new ecological civilization, new way of being so that we don't, because even if you use renewable energy, how much energy can you produce? If we go on increasing our demand and our need for more energy, you can have solar panels all over Britain, and you can have windmills all over your nearby oceans and seas. Still, there won't be enough energy because how much energy can nature provide? So techno-fixing or technological solution has become much more focused, whereas in the 60s and 70s and 80s even, I would say there was a much more emphasis on, like John Seymour, self-sufficiency, that kind of thing, living soil. So there was a much more emphasis on how we live in harmony with nature. What do you think?
Yeah. I mean, I'm celebrating the degree to which we can now look to technology to provide, as I've described it, the foundations for what else we need to do.
Yeah.
And you certainly wouldn't look to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change as a place to get really deep, enlightened philosophical thought. I mean, framework conventions are not set up for that purpose. So COPs are there to do what is needed by way of getting international consensus about a solutions-based agenda, much of which is technology-based. The fact they failed for the best part of 30 years is neither here nor there. That's what they were set up to do. And I feel now that we need to be a little bit more forgiving, Satish, of those who are
hear from you.
passionate. Exactly. I've already bared my soul about this to my colleagues here. I think we need to be more forgiving about people who are making the technology story work for the whole of humankind. There's no point. For me, out of the kind of available energy that one can put into things and help make stuff happen, I give not one single corpuscle of my active engagement going after the technology enthusiasts these days. I want them to flourish. I want them to go on being brilliant. I want them to make these renewable energy technologies work even harder for the betterment of the whole of humankind. I want them to drive this innovation story so unbelievably hard that they actually get to the point where the whole of humankind would be able to benefit from the energy services of this suite of technology without any additional negative impacts on society and the planet. I want them to work harder. So I don't spend a lot of time saying, oh my God, stop trying to fix this stuff through technology. I want them to fix this stuff through technology because that will allow us to do what we need to do, which is to put in place the transformation of our lives from a deeper perspective about what it is that provides meaning, purpose, opportunities to flourish, and for a large number of people survive in this world. I want them to get really good at what they do so we can get even better at what we do.
Jonathan, if I can, for the sake of discussion as well, and also for my own enlightenment, I would say that it's a mirage that technology will, in the end, solve the problems.
I didn't say that.
You didn't say that, but
No.
I'm saying.
Okay, well, so we would agree. If you ever meet anybody who says technology is going to solve the problem, they're either a fantasist or a liar.
Yeah.
So we absolutely agree about that.
Yeah. Okay.
But you get quite close to saying that they're a dangerous diversion from what we really should be doing.
Yes.
Yes. Well, I am not with you on that.
Yeah. Okay.
Because I know that if they don't do what they need to do, you won't be able to thrive in achieving the things that you want to achieve.
But in the end, they are not they and we are not we. They and we are together.
Well, clearly not at the moment, Satish.
At the moment,
you are definitely not with them on this one.
Okay. But if the technology has been with us for last 100, 200 years, the kind of industrial technology, and we have made tremendous sort of progress in technological sphere.
Yeah.
But it has not solved the problem of social justice, it has no problem of feeding people, it has no problem of poverty, hunger. So I don't have a kind of trust in technology. I feel it's a kind of con that we will solve the problem with and renewable energy. We have to reduce our need and demand for energy rather than always go on increasing our demand and need. So I'm a bit more suspicious of technological solutions, but I'm open to hear your argument.
No, I welcome your skepticism.
Yeah.
We need it. It's good.
Yeah.
It's good. It doesn't make me feel uncomfortable that you're very skeptical about technology, because we probably all should be. At least we shouldn't be really skeptical about the technology. We should be skeptical about the people who are making money out of the technology, which is a slightly different thing, by the way. But anyway, let's not go down that road.
But how do you separate, making money, even this pandemic and medicine, people have used this to make money. Even renewable energy, people are taking into a centralized, controlled, making money, making profit. So making money, making profit, capitalist system, that is driving even this ecological paradigm or the climate change paradigm that you are talking about. So how do we kind of separate this capitalist mindset of making money? Medicine, for example. Medicine is a good thing, and people need medicine for good health and good medicine. But medicine has become a source of making big money, big pharma. And so in whatever field you take, technology and capitalism mixed together, married together, are creating more problems than they're solving.
This current
system,
system of combining technology with profit is making it impossible to think about a sustainable, compassionate world for 8 billion people. That's true.
Yeah.
But that's not necessarily the only system. And sometimes I'm critical of the arm waving attacks on capitalism per se, because I keep pressing people and saying, okay, we have got a very short window of time to do what we need to do. We have a dominant economic paradigm in the world today. If your prospects for doing what we need to do are dependent on getting rid of capitalism first, you're entirely mad. You are completely mad. We look at us. Whereas if you think about it in terms of the leverage that people who share our worldview have, we're a microscopically small part of the total influencing world out there today. Microscopically small still. I'm kind of nervous about illusions on this score. So when people set up a kind of sequence of things, yep, capitalism is the source of the problem, got to get rid of capitalism first, then we can create this wonderful, sustainable, compassionate, just, and planet-hugging world for 8 billion people. In that order.
Yeah.
I don't go there, Satish. I'm sorry, I just don't go there, because we'll have lost this planet and most people on it if that's the ordering that we've got to make work.
No, yes, you are being more realistic, I must say, and I'm being a bit more kind of dreamy or idealistic.
No, it's good.
Yeah. Yes. So, moving from technology, you asked me to say a few words this morning about spirituality. And it will be very interesting for our Schumacher College students and others who are not here to hear what your take on spirituality and the spiritual values or non-material values going with the... But we are always talking about external change in technology, change in economics, change in energy systems. They're all external change. But what about the inner change? Without inner consciousness change, in our mindset change, in our heart change, this external change is not going to be enough. So the external and internal, the outer and inner, how these two can go together. And I said this morning that they have to go together. It'll be very interesting to hear how you see.
I entirely agree with that. Absolutely. And it's always been a very big part of my own life, as you know, in terms of what it is that enables me to do the work I do and keep me sane and inspired about our work and our connections with other people and with the planet. It's been absolutely critical to me. I would not have been able to do it if I hadn't had that dimension to my own life. I'm not a happy activist in the same way that Satish described himself today, which I love. I've come across this idea before as a happy activist. I'm not really a happy activist. I'm kind of slightly scrunched up and unhappy activist. And there are moments in my life where if I didn't have a deep spiritual rationale for what I do with a lot of other people, and couldn't replenish that source of energy in myself through contact with the natural world, then I would not have done 50 years of this stuff. So I'm very aware of what that actually means and feels like, and debts of gratitude, therefore, that I know are owed, as far as I'm concerned, for that opportunity to keep going. And the internal and external is absolutely right, but we've talked about this before, Satish. I'm interested in the spiritual dimension from a much more militant, externally focused, world-changing perspective. I'm sort of still slightly nervous about the inner work if the inner work doesn't have an external thing that it helps to get done. So there is a little bit of spirituality in the Green Movement that is self-indulgently introspective, and in my harsher view of the world, I'm much harsher about the world than Satish, obviously, but in my harsher view of the world, I find that stuff pretty difficult, and I want to sort of shake people around when I think about that, and I think, okay, look, great, you may be marginally more enlightened at the end of this week than you were at the start of this week, but so bloody what? If that's not actually going to make it possible for us all to have the privilege of being a bit more enlightened at some point in the future, which means you're going to have to be militantly active. And I think, for me, that's a crucial part of it.
Yes.
And to be honest, you're pretty bloody militant too. You'll use different language from me, obviously. It's much nicer and gentler and more tolerant, but you're not exactly lacking in militancy, if you don't mind me saying.
No. I am an activist. I agree with you. Spirituality is not retiring from the world.
Exactly.
Spirituality is not closing your eyes and saying that I'm going to just meditate and it's kind of New Age ecology, New Age spirituality. And my model of a spiritual activist and a militant activist is Gandhi, who was a deeply spiritual person. Not a single day he will miss when he has not has done his meditation or reflected on his spiritual inner lifestyle. But that inner spiritual dimension made him stronger and resilient to go to prison and say, I'm going to jail like a bridegroom goes to wedding chamber. Happily. So those activists who can use their spiritual strength and make their spirit strong and resilient and go out in the world and are prepared to take non-violent action based in spirituality does not inflict suffering on others. Take suffering upon yourself, like Gandhi did, Martin Luther King did, and many others did. Nelson Mandela, I think, is another example, 27 years in jail. And the other thing spirituality means that the ends cannot justify means. So if you are trying to achieve something, this is why our discussion about technology has a relevance, because if you want to achieve something, your means of achieving that has to be incongruent with your aims. So sometimes when we try to save the world, we try to get there, and therefore in our desperation, we compromise our means. And so spirituality equips you to use right means for the right ends. Would you?
If you're lucky.
If you are lucky.
There are an awful lot of people distributed through history who have used, either from a spiritual or religious perspective, who have used deeply abusive means to achieve their ends. And again, this is, and you and I are completely at one on the difference between organized, institutionalized religion and spirituality. But nonetheless, even if you just kind of stick to the historical story about the role of religion and spirituality in the world today, it ain't a pretty picture. I mean, it's not as if this is a sort of wonderful record of coupling up ethically means and ends. It's a diabolical historical story, which has involved decades of pain being inflicted
on others,
on populations the world over, and in particular, of course, on women for centuries, on indigenous people, in ways that I'm loath to just leave behind. And those people were using those means to justify their ends, and those means were utterly horrific.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think we agree on that.
Yeah.
But I don't believe spirituality automatically guarantees that the means that you will use will be completely compatible with the ethical base you're talking about. Because I don't think history
always mean.
I don't think history lets us say that. And I mean, your sense of history in this regard is very telling, Satish, because you have some astonishing role models who help you do the work that you do and always have done. And they are enormously important. Yeah. There's no question about that. And you are able to convert those histories and that genius into something that serves people's spiritual views today, which is really important. I really admire that. But I suppose
history does not.
I know.
History is evidence.
Yes, but anyway, look, it's for me. I think that I continue to think that I wouldn't go so far as you did today with our session this morning, where you said that without a spiritual dimension, the climate movement will never be able to achieve its goals. I wrote it down. Yeah. I didn't want you picking me up on any loose language later on. Yeah. I wrote it down because obviously I was facilitating Satish, so I couldn't say, what? You don't really mean that, do you? But now I'm not facilitating you. Now we're in conversation. I want to say to you, I know exactly what you mean about that. And for you, the spiritual dimension is so deeply you. It's not part of you, it is you. And therefore for you, when you think about what the movement looks like, it has to have a spiritual heartland. because otherwise it's not going to beat with the kind of integrity and authenticity that you so desperately want to underpin all our climate work. That's, for me, I totally understand where you're coming from there, but I don't agree, because for me, the spiritual dimension is a critical part of the climate movement. But the idea that the climate movement will only succeed in the way that we want it to, because it's spiritually charged and empowered, that's again somewhere where you and I would sort of at that point diverge.
Yeah.
You
No,
amicably, obviously, but we would definitely diverge.
I honor you are more realistic, more practical, more pragmatic. You see the world as it is, and I'm a little bit more sort of dreamy.
No, that's not quite what I was actually putting back to you.
Okay.
Because it's the preconditionality, it's the sort of there is a sort of absolutism in a position that says this can only do the job in hand, which is to transition fast enough to make for this safe operating space for humankind. There is something, it isn't dreamy, but it's quite an absolutist view to say that this has to be driven primarily by a spiritual impulse.
Can I say, rather than it has to be, I would say that we cannot separate the outer and the inner.
Yeah.
And therefore, for example, we cannot separate. I'm a kind of non-dualist. And if you separate matter and spirit, outer and inner, then it's a kind of, for me, and I would like your view on it, kind of dualism, separation. I see matter cannot exist. So when Christians say Holy Spirit, I say, but please remember holy matter. Matter is also sacred, as you quoting Shakespeare. So, so the kind of matter is also holy. So if you are non-dualist, then you will say the inner and outer have to go together. You cannot just tackle the outer without the inner. You cannot change material organization and a kind of external structures without changing the spirit of the organization, the soul of the organization. So what I'm trying to say is that you cannot separate them. Therefore, they have to go together. That's a kind of non-dualistic view. You cannot just change the structure, the organization, and the management without changing the spirit, without changing the inner reality. You cannot separate that. That's my sort of thinking or understanding. But I would like your view, because I respect your view.
Yeah. I mean, the prospect of changing the core of identity in any, for instance, of the large companies that Forum for the Future works with, it is so palpably out of reach of any organization, so literally non-feasible, that I wouldn't even articulate that as a goal of the work we do.
Okay.
We couldn't, because if we did articulate that as a goal, I don't know, those organizations would still be pretty much in the same place where they were anyway. Because they don't see it like that. They don't. It's funny how it is really interesting when you talk about it organizationally, because most organizations do not, if you're lucky, they might acknowledge they've got some shared values and a shared purpose, but they don't necessarily go much further than that, as in seeing themselves as an entity that would subscribe to a set of spiritual values-based precepts in everything they do. They really don't go that far. So it's so interesting when you put it like that, because for me that's just it just is a non-starter.
Yeah.
But mind you, I mean, you can still do really interesting.
Now, values, purpose, all those come into spiritual dimension. I mean, for example, these big organizations you work with, Forum for the Future, with big businesses. The businesses have something called HR department, Human Resources Department.
So do quite small organizations. I'm told that Darting's just appointed.
I said to Dartington people that you are really trying to change your HR, not human resources, but human relationship. That's what I suggest to them. So the moment you start to use humans as a resource for your economy, for your profit, for running your organization, etc., then you are, in a way, ignoring the spiritual dimension. In the same way, if you change nature as a resource, and this is what we have done, the businesses with which you work, many of the businesses, they see nature as a resource for the economy. And they see their staff, their workers, their kind of all the sort of people working in their businesses, they're all their resources to make money, to success the organization. And I think that is, for me, so fundamentally misguided. Unless you change that nature is sacred, that human life is sacred, and you cannot use nature and humans as a resource, HR has to go. If an organization running HR department as a human resource department, that cannot succeed in bringing a sustainable, regenerative, long-lasting planetary system. So for me, it's so essential.
Yeah. But it's also, it may be essential, but it is fundamentally, I don't mean this disparagingly, but it is unworldly.
Yeah.
As in, you do have to engage with an organization, partly coming from the place that you're coming from, and partly in response to the place where they're coming from.
Yeah.
And if you're not prepared to do that intermingling of respective norms, values, behaviors, expectations, aspirations, if you're not prepared to go into some of their space, you're only going to bring your views into that. Don't bother working with other organizations. Just don't bother, because you've got to meet people, if not completely halfway, then you've certainly got to be extremely tolerant and understanding of what it is that people bring into that.
No, I see that. Yeah. And you are working more directly with businesses, and I'm not. Occasionally, I get invited to speak to some business, but very rarely. And normally, I speak to already sort of preaching to converted, so to speak, mostly.
Well, not necessarily. No, I mean, and it is fascinating when you do try and push the boat out a little bit further, Satish. You can imagine what it's like if you really decide, okay, I've had enough of this pragmatic, incremental change focus where we're talking about this and that, using language like ecosystem services and natural capital, which I know is one of your total bugbears. I wrote a book some time ago called Capitalism as if the Earth Matters, and I remember being very seriously upbraided by Satish for using the concept of natural capital as if to say, as if I'd completely betrayed everything that our shared history stood for.
And still, we are friends.
And a bit of me said, I hate, some bit of me hates the use of concepts like natural capital, but then sometimes my pragmatism will overwhelm my sense of what is the right way of approaching this more philosophically. But sometimes it is quite fun. You can try these things, and actually sometimes businesses are more receptive to them than you might think.
Yes.
And that is always very heartening, because then you have to remind yourself, do not assume that they're in this defensive redoubt of Western enlightened materialism and empiricism. Don't assume that that's where they are automatically. They may well be in a different place, so test it. Keep testing it.
Yeah.
So occasionally, you've seen, Satish, I always have my stone with me. I carry a stone wherever I go. And it's one of my coping strategies, because I don't get to spend as much time in and enjoying the natural world as I would like. In fact, considerably less. But a kind of shortcut is to always have a stone with me. And wherever I go to a place, I take a stone. I know this isn't best practice, but trust me, it's okay. I take a stone, I leave a stone behind. And it's a kind of, and I've done this actually for the best part of 40 years now. And it's a sort of thread of connectivity through stones that is a bit odd for some people. But occasionally when I'm with businesses, I will bring out my stone and I will say, okay, what does this mean to you? Does this mean anything? And they'll sort of look at you and say, oh God. we always thought there was something pretty dippy about Jonathon Porritt. You know, he's a fellow of Findhorn, for God's sake, he must be wacky. Or anything like that. And then you can start to open up a different discussion, because you've kind of taken them out of a comfort zone, but you can begin to explore what connectivity might look like with the natural world at a deeper level. And sometimes that will work, I have to tell you. Sometimes it absolutely doesn't, and you feel like a total plonker. And, you know.
But when it works?
When it works, it doesn't actually ever land in the meeting. It almost always lands in the relationship, the way that the relationship with the individuals changes afterwards.
Yes.
That's where it lands.
Yeah.
And that I obviously love that, because that's important. But you're right, that's why, so when Satish was talking today, he sort of happily dropped into his conversation some Shakespearean quotes, as it were, and we were both celebrating this amazing quote from As You Like It, where the Duke in As You Like It finds himself in the forest. And of course, he's put behind him all the trappings of his ghastly luxury court, and everybody being servile and pampered and, you know, all the stuff you'd expect. And they're in the forest and living in the forest. And he comes up with this sort of wonderful story about how in the forest they find, and this is the quote that Satish used today, they find tongues in trees and books in babbling brooks and sermons in stones. And then the last bit of the quote is, and good in everything.
Yes.
And it's it is actually it's not particularly good Shakespearean poetry, by the way, because there's a lot of really suboptimal alliteration going on there. And Shakespeare doesn't usually do second-rate internal rhyming, as in books and brooks. That's, you know, honestly, it's not top-notch. Not top-notch. But it is powerful, and the kind of thing that you take away from that, which is so amazing, is that he was able in that sense to capture a pantheist or panentheist vision just effortlessly in 2 lines. That this is how the natural world can speak to us now. I mean, of course, at the end of As You Like It, they all go back to their bloody court and presumably behave in as much self-indulgent, materialistic ways as they did before they got stuck in the forest.
Now, we have had sort of nearly 45 minutes of conversation, and you can say there are some nuances. There are lots of things we agree, but there are some nuances where we have a little bit of a different take, but still our heart is very close. And I love Jonathon and his commitment, his life, and he's always been extremely kind to me. And whenever I ask something, he always obliges me. He always helps me. So I'm very grateful to you. I can say to my students here in Schumacher College that I'm really grateful to have this friendship. And among the friends, you don't always have to agree with everything. You can have different views, different ideas. Still, you can be good friends and work together. So this has been my privilege. But I would like to open the discussion. And if any of you would like to ask any question to Jonathon or to me or whatever you want to make a comment, please feel free. Next 15 minutes, we can have some questions, answers from you. So anybody would like to, speak loudly. Okay. No, I think that's a very good point. In agriculture, there are lots of new thinking and new practices coming, as agroecology, forest gardening, permaculture. These movements have grown, and wilding is now a new movement. And Isabella Tree came here, and I visited her Nep estate, and we were talking about Ben Goldsmith. He's wilding his farm. So there's a new movement, and there's a new interest in land and agriculture, lots of young people. And we have launched at Schumacher College a master's degree program on food and farming, regenerative food and farming. And in the very first year, this year, we have 20 students. We are full. And we run a 6 monthly course in gardening, including permaculture, agroecology, and all those dimensions. And every year for the last 8 or 9 years, every year courses are full. So there's a tremendous interest among young people. And I was invited to speak at the Oxford Real Farmers Conference this year. And I gave 2 or 3 sessions. And one of the sessions was on meditation. And I said, farmers need to meditate. And I read my meditation, which I read to you this morning. And BBC picked it up. They recorded it, and in Farmers, like the Farming Today program, Farming Today, and they repeated my meditation, and they interviewed me and said, why do you think farmers need meditation? And so there is a kind of change in agricultural sector. And this Real Farmers Conference, they had something like, I don't know, about 2,000 people from all over the world online, well, all Zoom, all online, and all over the world, they were listening. And so it's a kind of big new awareness. And wilding is also, and even government is putting millions of pounds to give grants to farmers who will wild and leave the land wild. And the government is saying that we will give grants to landowners who not only produce food, but also look after the environment. Isn't that the case, Jonathan?
They'll give farmers the dribs and drabs that are left over from their subsidy-based system. We had a session this morning, Satish, where we looked at the amount of public money, taxpayers' money, that is invested in planet-trashing agriculture, which is $530 billion per annum. And it's not that I'm very excited by these new ways of looking at balancing food production and nature, conservation, biodiversity, etc. Because actually the potential is enormous, and the productivity could be enormous as well if we were just talking about productivity. But again, sorry to be boringly realistic, maybe we could swap roles for a minute here. I could be the dreamy. You could do this sort of tedious, realistic shtick. But if I'm just sticking with my shtick for a moment, governments have always been happy about fringe movements of that kind. And this stuff, relatively speaking, in the world today is completely fringe still. Unfortunately, because the power of the agri-business empires in these countries is so unbelievably strong. Now, for me, it doesn't matter whether they're small at the moment, because I call it practicing. We're all getting ready for the moment where this stuff is no longer possible. And it's not far away. And we need to do this at a much bigger scale with a much greater sense of the contribution that it would make. And that's, I think, where we completely agree. But you'd still have to be, unfortunately, very realistic about what governments do or don't want to support at the moment.
And what they are giving is very minuscule, very small.
It's tiny at the moment. It will grow. It will grow because every country is going to have to reconcile this story about land use. And it will need to be a combination of these different purposes around biodiversity, conservation, food production, recarbonization of the soils, etc., etc. You're going to have multi-use farming systems of one kind or another, not just on a few hectares stuck away in the part of the country that is not deemed by the government to be important from a productivity point of view. We're going to have it universally across every single hectare of land. I mean, that is one of the things that will happen. That will happen. Thank you. Anyone else? Yes.
I'd like you to talk about patriarchy and how it's changed in the last 50 years, or if it's changed, and is it something that I'm very confused about? I know that young women now are infinitely more confident than I was when I was young. And it also seems as though patriarchy, like capitalism, is so deeply entrenched that it's hard to see how anything can change, really. So I'd be very interested to hear how you two feel about it.
Jonathan.
Yeah. Well, if, if Satish can say that the spiritual dimension is a precondition of effectiveness in the climate movement, I think I can get away with saying that if we don't address continuing patriarchal attitudes, behaviors, and forms of oppression at every single level in society, then prospects for a just, sustainable, compassionate world are zero. Are zero.
Very good.
Because our world is still a patriarchal world in almost every respect. And when you look at you start at the spectrum of what this means, what this means for women, forgive me as I'm saying this, but what it means for women, and you start at the extreme edges of the levels of violence that men inflict on women, all the way through to the kind of behaviors that are considered to be just low-level harassment or what do they call it? Banter. And you think about that spectrum for women of all ages, it is so completely intolerable today to think that that is the living reality for very large numbers of women in most countries. And I'm not just talking about this country. I mean, there was an astonishing program on Radio 4 recently just talking about what happens to young women who can no longer just do not have the freedom to be out and about in the way they might want with their friends, doing what they want to do, dressing the way they want to work, just because of the fear, the constant fear of being on the streets, and with the quite strong likelihood that men will be imposing themselves on that freedom that women might have. It's so big. It's massive. And my organization, Forum for the Future, we do quite a bit of work on this as part of our commitment to a more just society. But sometimes I'm just daunted by the scale of what still goes on and the utter unreconstructed, rebarbative primitivism of so many men. I do really dislike most men. I've kind of just really just have ended up in a not particularly good place where the oppressive nature of how men impose themselves on other people and the world is repugnant.
I think I ditto every word what Jonathon has said. And I think we need a tremendous change of culture, particularly men, respecting and honoring feminine, women and feminine principle as well. Because we have a very much sort of idea of control and subjugation and domination. And that patriarchy has not only negatively and badly affected our women folks, but also the way we have used masculinity and patriarchy and dominated nature. And so ecofeminism is also a very important part of our movement. And therefore, I think we need to, the men need to learn a bit of feminine principle and learn how not to try to always subjugate and control and dominate and all that. So I think that's a very important principle. Thank you. Yes, please. Last question.
Jonathan, I noticed that when you talked about your early stages in the ecological movement, people looked at you and said you were crazy. And it's happening less now today. And we noted that people that think that we need to solve capitalism before we can solve climate change and ecological crises, they're not crazy to think that that is about to pass. And I'm just curious how you reflect on that and the role that those individuals that are championing this need for the ecological movement to be rooted in spirituality, be rooted in sort of anti-capitalism, you're 450 years, or sorry, 50 years, what, a large number of years in the movement, and what's changed in you over that time?
Blimey.
Good question.
Okay.
You can answer.
Yeah, it's only 25 years of my life that I've been working with business. We set up Forum for the Future in 1996. And before that, I spent no time at all working with business. But I became persuaded that if we didn't get better at harnessing the creativity and energy and power of business, then we would be missing a trick, because they're a huge presence in people's lives. They just are enormously influential. So that was a kind of expedient decision, that if you've got a power base that strong in society, we need to get better at finding ways of working with it. And that was an extremely pragmatic basis on which Forum for the Future was set up by 3 members of the Green Party. So I mean, an extremely improbable juxtaposition of 3 members of the Green Party trying to set up an organization to work with big business. We knew that at the time. I don't spend any time at all worrying about why people do the work that they do. For me, if the story for someone is that they are first and foremost an anti-capitalist campaigner, and then they want to bring their climate work into that frame, that's fine. Honestly and truly, that's absolutely fine. I sort of have a sense of, I wish you well, because it's good. But for me, I suppose I want to keep trying to combine the practical with the radical and the idealistic, as Satish was saying. And that is one of the things where Satish and I do have a slight difference on our emotional reservoir. What do I feel? You see, I'm still driven very often by a lot of anger. And in the session with Satish this morning, he reminded us all that anger is an extremely questionable, often dangerous emotional response to what's happening in the world. But just as much as I depend on hugging trees to survive, I also depend on anger keeping me sharp and keeping me completely committed. I am so angry so often at what is happening to our world that and genuinely, Satish and I have talked about this before, I couldn't do what I do if I hadn't had that driver of anger to get me going and pick up on things that seem to be lost and forlorn and get out there and stick the boot in again. And this is all very unacceptable language, I admit, but it's just, I can't do it. So I do try and manage my anger. I've never been officially on an anger management course because I'd be so angry about it that it really wouldn't help very much, but I try and temper it with all sorts of other things. So I do go out of my way to find sources of joy and celebration, love just having fun and being lighthearted. But that's not instead of the anger. That's to help me bring anger into it with redemptive power. And I think I love listening so much to what Satish said, because you were talking about Martin Luther King today, who of course was an astonishing embodiment of the power of love and the redemptive power of love. He spoke and wrote a lot about love as redemption in people's lives. But he also acknowledged that sometimes people would be swept up in anger. And he would say, fine, but don't let your anger destroy you or anyone else. Anger will only be useful to you if it is harnessed to that redemptive power. And he was very clear about that nobody could rid the world of the anger, because if you look at the world as it is today, there are plentiful reasons to go on being angry about it. But if that then is the thing that is solely your reason for doing what you do, it will destroy you. That anger disconnected from redemption and love will destroy you. And I can't say I've got that balance right yet, but I'm an apprentice still. I've only been at it 50 years, so I'm going to keep cracking along and see if I get it right in the next 25 years, whatever happens.
Yeah, now that's a very, very good answer. Perhaps if I say that anger has a place, because everything has a place, but in its place. And like in food, if you are going to an Indian restaurant, you have a chili in the food.
I don't.
You don't. Okay. But if you like Indian curry, Indian food, then you have a bit of chili in it. But how much you put chili in it? That's the question. So I would say anger has a place. We are humans. We have all emotions there. But and I agree with you that unless that redemption and that power of love balancing it, then it can erode you, your inner soul, your inner spirit. You can, in anger, you can just angry. And anger is, when you are angry, it can also affect your personal life, your family life, your friends. And I mean, you have anger for the world being destroyed and so on, but you are very kind and very, very loving in your personal relationships. So that's a kind of balancing dimension. And you have this other side. So it's not all anger that is driving you. So that's a big...
But I'm loving the emerging metaphor here, Satish. I never thought I'd see this in terms of curry, because I don't really eat curry, but I'm just getting that you're a very gentle, mild korma, and I'm a very sort of unpredictably hot and fiery vindaloo. And the two dishes can sit on the table at the same time.
Yes.
Yes, okay. Phew, we got there.
Yes. So thank you, Jonathan, for this.
Thank you, Satish. It's wonderful.
I hope you have enjoyed the conversation. And thank you all for coming. And thank you also, if I may take this opportunity to thank you for being here this whole week, running this course here. This has been marvelous. And we are grateful and delighted. And we hope to see you again at Dartington and at Schumacher College, particularly when our old postern is back in normal.
With the roof restored.
With the roof, then we will invite you again. So thank you very much.
Satish, thank you very much.
Thank you.
In the bar.
In the bar, yes.